Tēnā koutou katoa, nau mahara mai ki tēnei komiti whiriwhiri take Māori. Nau mai hara mai. Tēnā koe e te minita, tēnā koe Dave.
Tēnā koe.
Welcome to everybody. Thank you very much for coming for us. We've got a little bit of time with you this morning, as you can see by our structured agenda itself. And we will be doing our best to manage our time within the brackets here. And so the first part here is about the transfer of functions of the function of Te Arawhiti, otherwise known as Tari Whakatau now, over to TPK. But before we do that, Minister, I'd ask perhaps for some opening comments from you before we get stuck into it. So tēnā koe.
Tēnā tātou katoa, kia hora te māreno, kia whakapapa pauna mo te moana, kia tere te kāru i rohi ki moi a tātou. Whakahono retia tō tātou kuini, tau mai rā ki tōna ahure watapu. E kanohi ki mo te rarangi kiwi, mo te kāhui kiwi a ona mātua tupu. Tai atu ki ngā mate o te wā, e upane kaupana nei ki ngā tātou, ko ki tuatu o pai mai mahara, ki mai ki a tātou katoa. Tērā Māori McDonald mā, Tam Te Kins mā, Fred Graham mā, Aurora Mārei kura, katoa rātou, Richard Parata, ina nahi rā, Mike Pohio, ki roto o Rāpaki, nē rā kātu tini aitua o te pō. Nā, kāpati tātou, e tui nei, e hui nei ki te kaupapa karanga, ki a koutou te aku tātā kura, e ngana nei ki te hāpua i ngā tikanga mātua tupu, e kaha nei ki te whakakoi hoki te anga whakamua tō tātou reo, hui tōpū nei ki te whakatārewa hoki ngā mahi ki ngā whenua, ngā mahi ahu whenua, tēnā koe uhana, me tō kapu. Koera hoki te kapu nui o te taitoka i tēnei wā. Whānau, enei take whakahara rawa e whakatairanga i tō tātou tuakiritanga, i tō tātou ahurea, tērā tohunga tūmau i tērā wiki, aku whakapāha e hoa mā. Engari reira hoki koe uhana e whakakoru nei i te ātā mira. Pērā i taku tuakana haimona stage breaker maruera, mihana ki a koe, me te kawe atu i tērā kaupapa ki te tautokarau. Whānau, he nui ngā kaupapa kōrero, he nui ngā kaupapa e a whio nei, e tangi nei o tō tātou tuakiritanga. Kei konei hoki a Dave, te hekere tari o te puni pōkiri, te rina me ngā apataki, mai tautoko, i tēnei kaupapa rangatira atu. E ai ki te kororo, e toru pēr ngā haora, mō ngā mahi a te puni kōkiri, Vote Māori Development, ko tai te haora mō te kaupapa Vote Whānau Ora. Me te mea nei, ko ngā piki me ngā heke o tō tātou kāwanatanga e hoa mā, ke te pokapū o te puni kōkiri i tēnei wā. Me te mea nei, e ti take, ke te piki haere, e ti take ke te tārewa tonu, e ti take ki te marea, ke te heke haere, ko tāku i tēnei wā, te whakaminita i enei kaupapa rangatira, me te whaiwhai hoki i ngā uaratanga mō te puni kōkiri, e rimo ona uaratanga, me te whakakiko kōrero e pāna ki ngā mahi re hau, pērā i a tonu i Māori, pērā i ngā mahi mō te ture whenua Māori, pērā i te arotake i ngā mahi a ngā ohu reo Māori, i raro i a Pānia Greima, tai atu ki iti o ngā kaupapa ohanga, e whakarewa nei i te whairawa, i te whaipute hoki, pērā i fast track, rauawa, me rā momo kaupapa. Ko tā taku wero ki a Dave mā, he hiki pene, he thrapens noiho te pūtea ka tukuna atu ki a Dave. Raro i te kotahi pai hinati o te nui pūtea e te toha tia ki ngā ohu katoa. Ko te tino whainga matua a Dave, ko te aro hai me te aro pake i te iwa te kau mā iwa pai hinati o te pūtea ka toha atu ki ohu ke. Ki te kore ia me ngā kaimahi o te puni kōkiri e whakahāngai te anga whakamua o te iwa te kau mā iwa pai hinati o hei aha mā te puni kōkiri. Koira te kaupapa matua i roto i te ture, Ministry of Māori Development Act 1991, promoting the achievement of Māori across health, education, employment training, economic development, and holding the other agencies to account, which comprise 99.5% of all the funding that's distributed across different votes, for the adequacy of their services vis-a-vis Māori across those areas, health, education, economic development, and employment and training. So kia ora ki tērā reo. Koira te whangamatua. That's something that I've really challenged Dave around and the team, that most of the vote, 99 point something % across government, is through the mainstream agencies. And our expectation, certainly my expectation and what the government has endorsed, is that the monitoring and mentoring function of Te Puni Kōkiri is elevated and at the core of the mahi that Dave and the team are undertaking, and to hold other agencies to account. And fortunately, we've got some fantastic teammates, like young Zadie here.
Okay,
Yeah, put you up. Yep, 80, who's doing some marvellous work up on the 10th floor, 9th floor of the Puni Kōkiri around monitoring. So all those targets that the government has, 8 of the 9 key government targets, they've been the subject of serious inquiry and reporting and monitoring, and also recommendations how we can better deliver on those targets vis-a-vis Māori populations. And some of the results are actually quite surprising. For example, Māori are seeing emergency department specialists faster than the rest of the population. Who would have known? But we actually have faster engagement in the emergency department than the rest of the population. But one of the reasons why, and if you take that factoid by itself, you think that's a good thing, but it's not, because we actually present with higher triage issues. And that's a problem, and you roll that back to why is that the case? Because of our access to GPs and others. And I'm not saying that's the reason why I'm so enthusiastic about medical school like Waikato, but it would be good to have more rural doctors and health professionals. And I know there's a bit of a protest on today up north. You know, it really just this doesn't make me despondent, but it makes me disturbed that places like north of Kawakawa after 4 o'clock on Friday don't have doctors and nurses. You know, and WTA, what the aha on that. And hence why the mahi that I've really encouraged Dave to focus on is monitor the bulk of the vote and how, if and how other departments and ministries, government agencies are delivering on the adequacy of services, because if they're not, that has to be held up in lights and say, how can we do this better? And the team and the data monitoring team has been very enthusiastic by my enthusiasm, I hope, to do that. Anyway, that's where we're at, and happy to take direction and questions from the chair and focus on these sections, one section at a time.
Kia ora. Kia ora, te minita, and we'll kick straight off into this first section, and we'll go to Kenny.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Chair, e te tuakana e kautapu atu ana I wō mihi ki wō whātau whate. Me te āhuatanga o tō kōrero hei whakarite hia I te whamini kai te tāne. Ka tahuri tō tika atua hau ki tō pātai tuatahi ki a koe. Kua kōrero, sorry, I'll turn straight now to my question to you. Minister, you've spoken about the task ahead of Te Puni Kōkiri about making sure that they're able to measure the effectiveness of delivery for Māori across the broader vote and budget. So with respect to Māori Crown relations and the transfer of those functions into Te Puni Kōkiri, when can we expect a clear measurement matrix that will allow us to see whether or not there is value for money in what has transpired with the transfer of those functions?
Ka pai. So just a 30-second context, essentially the Māori Crown relations mahi within Te Arawhiti was lifted, shifted and dropped into Te Puni Kōkiri. And one of the reasons for that, or one of the drivers for that, is it's very hard for me to say, hand on heart, the group or the entity that's responsible for driving a hard negotiation around treaty settlements can then the next day after treaty settlement is signed saying we're going to be your best friend to help implement these settlement obligations, I think is quite strange. And whilst predecessors have said actually that's where we're going to go, agencies, as we know, have struggled to meet settlement commitments, and that's borne itself out in the recent report from John Ryan and the Office of the Attorney General. Importantly, though, we have had the first whole of system report against treaty settlement obligations, the implementation of same, in December last year. and that was presented to Cabinet and carried through in the Ombudsman report. For the most part, the lift and shift and movement has been conducted in a very diligent, professional manner. There has been a little bit of disruption along the way, but that is now integrated into the mahi that is led by Secretary for Māori Development, Dave, and delivered, I think, in a manner that is enduring. So now it's going to be a clear relationship lead vis-a-vis PSGEs, settlement government entities, and particularly around those settlement obligations, but also the accords, of which Te Puni is leading 9 of 12 of those accords. And one way we can measure the performance of the Crown against the Crown Māori relationship responsibilities is through the numbers that come out of treaty settlement obligations delivered, on track, yet to be triggered, or problem issues. And in the last 12 months, there have been problem issues, some of which we've addressed over the last couple of years, where, for example, the Kaitaia Airport or the Woodburn Airport, or some of the landlocked scenarios that have emerged as a result of weather, but have been tied into treaty settlements. There's a couple of those places up at Ngāti Apa, just in the centre of, around the centre of forest, and a couple of things, I don't call them hapa, but we missed sorting them during the settlement arrangements. Ngāti Rangi, Heratanga, Tamatea, they've got some legislation that's underway to just to correct some technical issues that emerge out of the settlement. So you can use that as a proxy for success. One indicator of success: how many settlement obligations have been completed, how many are on track, yada, 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 yet to be triggered, and delivery issues. And when you chunk that down, there's basically 4 big agencies: DOC, LINZ, Te Arawhiti, the Ministry of Education, that occupy about 60% to 2/3 of all settlement obligations. Now, if those ones aren't performing very well, then we've got a big problem. And the role that and responsibility that the Secretary has here is to make sure that all agencies are performing, but particularly being on the job with those 4, because they will make a very material shift in the delivery against settlement obligations. Separately, we have accords, of which there are 9, and I don't think there's a real appetite to create more accords. That's not what I've heard, but delivering on the accords that we do have is very, very important. Within those accords, there might be 80 to 100, I won't call them KPIs, but action items. And some of those are going very well, probably more than half. Some of them need a bit more work, and that's Petapai. And importantly, we have to make sure the accord hui actually happens. So we've had a couple of swing and misses this year, but they are happening with the Raukawa Accord, Ngāti Hawa Accord, Tūwharetua, Parihaka, Kāinga one, we went up to that. So what I see within those accords as a way to again measure, as you've described, the strength of the Māori Crown relationship is, are the accords healthy and being delivered on? So that's a second way we can measure that. A third way that we can measure, of course, is the engagement through the Iwi Chairs Forum and other peak bodies. Now, whilst everyone knows that last year we attended a couple of the hui, then we were disinvited as the Crown from the hui, the mahi still continues. So within the Iwi Chairs Forum, there are 5 PO, and within those PO, there are various work streams underway. Those are getting reported on a 3-monthly, 4-monthly basis. Some, I think, are going very well. So you look at example, Hautaki Ahurangi, which is led by Marama Royal, and Simon Watts on the ministerial lead side, has a couple of work streams, particularly around the resilience of marae. And some work has been undertaken to review the climate resilience, I think, of all marae in the country, definitely all the iwi marae, and I think some marae that are more pan-tribal. And that's resulted in a couple of action items like the water mahi out at Mātihi Marae during the week of Waitangi Week earlier this year. So those PO 5 within the Iwi Chairs from, again, another proxy to demonstrate the success or otherwise of the Crown Māori relationship. And then there's a whole range of other items, some of which get described in the House and debated in the House, where I think that there's another way to measure that. And of course, some people might refer to hipui and other matters as a demonstration of how healthy or not that relationship is.
Can you give us up?
No, I'm happy to give this.
Thank you.
supplementary
Whānau.
one.
Thank you, Minister, and appreciate that feedback. I know, we measure sometimes the success of a Crown Māori relationship based on the number of settlements or, the progress of a settlement. But, let's delve into what is the health of the Crown Māori relationship across all of its spheres, and what's the work plan of Te Puni Kōkiri now that they do have this relationship sphere of Te Arawhiti or Te Arawhiti coming across the TPK. So what is the work plan to really get out on the boots on the ground and test the health of the relationship across the Māori community, hapū iwi, moving forward now that this is the role of Te Puni Kōkiri proper?
Well, I think that, I've identified three touch points which can be used as indicators of success, but I don't think that they are exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination. And if the view is that we're going to go into I suppose another way to look at it is what are quantitative indicators and what are qualitative indicators. And certainly from the quantitative front, when I go through those particular indicators, those three spheres, I think there has been progress. I think that actually that's going okay. The qualitative, which is a lot more subjective, I think is often dependent on, how people feel on the day or a series of engagements and a series of, I suppose, inquiries as to how people are feeling about that relationship. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean if we go through a survey or something like that, that there's no progress. Often there is progress, but that doesn't obviously get emphasised in, the media reports. I'll give you an example. Sunday, I went to Rotorua. I didn't quite make it to the Tohunga Tumo, apologies, but I had to sort farming arrangements out at field days. We have been working very closely to ensure that there are houses developed around the country, and bolting on from Kāinga, Whānau and Kāinga work over the last 5 to 10 years. And all Whata 2B and 7D have been delivering about 95 houses out behind Fresh Choice on Tingai Road. Now, they are a credible shop. You got people like Jason Rogers and Rhona Bennett and others who are doing a great job. Well, we've seen that credibility work, and now we've doubled down on that by enabling some pūtea for Whata 2B 7D to develop 39 homes over in Kotu on the other side of Rotorua. If you get into that housing space, 1,000 houses were enabled through labour support, and we'll get to housing specifically. Since we've come into administration, another 1,000 houses has been enabled through the support of this government. And in addition, you have some other arrangements, that's just the Māori housing money, and other arrangements through Papa Kāinga and the mainstream funding. So I think that whilst the boots and all on the ground engagement is important from a qualitative level, you'll find that when you go to engage with folks like Rhona or Jason on all Whata 2B and 7D, they're very enthusiastic about the support that was given under the previous government, the support that has been given under this government, and ultimately the type of delivery for whānau in need. So when we were at all Whata 2B and 7D, out at Tingai, we came across some of the whānau that are living in those houses right now. They were stoked about how the government had supported their own whānau trust to build those homes. And now they got not only better whanaungatanga connection, but they're going to the marae on a regular for wata and paipai and rangatiratanga lessons. I think that's a good thing. And if you wanted me to say, okay, can you get out and find out at a qualitative level how people are feeling, I think there'll be some surprising results.
I wanted to ask, just in terms of budget uplift, I recognise Te Puni Kōkiri staff are the front door often for te iwi Māori.
Absolutely.
And that's where I guess I'm leading to in terms of you've received these additional services or string to the bow. Will we see more boots on the ground, because the kaimahi are valued in our communities and they are the front door? They're like, they're the arawhiti in terms of the suite of services available for the Crown that are available for Māori. So, I mean, it's a great opportunity. That's what I'm sharing.
Dave will right of you.
Just in terms of te arawhiti and boots on the ground, Te Puni Kōkiri has regional offices, as you know. Te arawhiti didn't. So, if anything, there will be an increase in terms of boots on the ground.
Good. Kia ora.
Takutai?
Yeah, kia ora, tēnā
Ngā
koe.
mihi.
E te me. Yeah, just following on from Hana's pātai. Yeah, so how will we see, so the department is receiving, this new transfer of mahi, so will we see, that more growth in terms of growth and retention around kaimahi for TPK, because like Hana said, they are the boots on the ground. And knowing that the department has had a $34 million decrease, how can we ensure that that is going to occur?
Well, the funding that came over from Māori Crown Relations was mainly for salary budget, and the people and the positions came over too. I think there were
44 positions,
44
24 of
positions.
those were people.
and 24 tinana in those positions. So all that came lifted and shifted and integrated now within Te Puni Kōkiri. But my expectation is that there will be more people as a result of that lift and shift, and some of that will be regionalised. Certainly when you come to implementing settlement obligations, a lot of that mahi happens in the regions. So it has to be on the ground, boots and all. Yeah, absolutely.
Just in terms of the implementation, Te Puni Kōkiri is not implementing the treaty settlements. That is the responsibility of those agencies who've been tasked with that function. And whether that be in education, whether that be in health, whatever those commitments are, our role is to hold them to account. Their role is to put boots on the ground and deliver that. Now, we'll facilitate that with our regional staff, but I just want to be clear, our role is to hold them to account and monitor those treaty settlements. And we have to remember that we're talking about 30 years, and the Auditor General's report over the last 30 years has been that those settlements have been viewed as transactional by the agencies. And there hasn't been a holistic or strategic view on how we could best position those post-settlement governance entities for the future. That is a function that Te Puni Kōkiri will think about in terms of our policy going forward. But it is a low bar. It has not been going well. Te Puni Kōkiri has got to fix this, and that's not going to happen quickly. There are some processes that we can follow, some immediate processes, and an example of that is having report backs from all those agencies against Te Haiata to identify their commitments and what has been achieved, and then work with agencies to identify where the gaps are, and then report this calendar year back to the government in terms of what has been achieved. But it's a start point. I view the Office of Auditor General's report almost like a performance improvement framework for commitments on treaty settlements.
I think just to echo some of the sentiment that Dave shared, one of the good functional changes that's going to be undertaken for Te Haiata, which is the mechanism through which the settlement obligations are effectively monitored, is ensuring that non-core Crown agency commitments are now recorded in Te Haiata, because that hasn't happened today. And a lot of the commitments across the treaty settlement obligation space actually are not core Crown, they're non-core Crown. So just getting that on Te Haiata is a good step, but ultimately Dave is accurate in the sense that most of the commitments, nearly all of them actually, are out with agencies, core or non-core Crown. The role of Te Puni Kōkiri is to make sure that there are systems in place to enable that. We had the whole of system government report last December at Cabinet, and I think people got a bit of a surprise, not just with the nature of that report, but the fact that there are so many obligations. And I don't think anyone in 1993 or 4, when some of us were fortunately working at Te Puni Kōkiri, probably imagined there were going to be 20 or 30,000 settlement obligations. That's what's materialised. We are responsible for that, and now we've got to go out and deliver. And we're pretty geared up to do that. The other thing is that, and I expect Dave to have the relevant court at all with Sir Brian Roach and others, making sure that the settlement commitments are upheld. In my view, is a discussion around performance expectations of all the chief executives. And we'll leave that discussion for the public service, but I think there's one way to incentivise shift and change in organisations is to say it's part of CEO performance expectation. And hey, that's a discussion to be had with Dave and Sir Brian Roach and others.
Okay, Willie.
Kia ora, Minister, tēnā koe, ko te TPK tāmai nei tēnei wā.
Kia ora.
Whakarangatira te kaupapa, ngā mihi kia koutou. Just further to your kōrero, Minister, in terms of the broader aspects in terms of public agencies, you know, and commitment to kaupapa Māori. Dave, I want to know what's the response been given the Auditor General was scathing in his review of public agencies' treatment of hapū and iwi in May, and said that they had to get their act together because it was basically belittling and humiliating for our iwi and hapū in terms of fulfilling the obligations of treaty settlements. What's the response to TPK to that in terms of public agencies fulfilling their obligations?
I would describe it as a wake-up call in terms of the commitment to those settlements. And there are some truths there that provide opportunities for the future.
Yeah.
I mentioned transactional, seeing the settlement as the end, when really it's the end of the beginning. And if we think about Māori development in its whole context, what we have at the end of a settlement is a post-settlement governance entity. And that post-settlement governance entity has come about through engagements with the Crown on a treaty settlement that sometimes can take decades. And at the end of that process, and quite a lot of resource, human resource and money from both sides, what we have at the end of that is an entity located in the regions that has agency, that has credibility, has resource, and has ongoing commitments from the Crown. That's quite important to note. And I'm not sure that everybody sees that, because we see the transactional. So what can be achieved? Now, we know that every settlement entity now is either $1 billion entity or a multi-million-dollar entity. The government's focus is on regional development. Where is the opportunity side of this? The Auditor General's right in identifying the obligations, and we need to meet those obligations. But there's two sides of this coin. There are some opportunities here, and those opportunities are around those significant entities with agency, credibility, a community of constituents that we describe as whānau, and the wider community. So I think it was a wake-up call. Willie,
Can I ask what the response has been? Has the department or the minister met with the Auditor General to
okay,
roll out a strategy in terms of dealing with this? Because our people should not have to put up with this, should they?
there are a number of immediates. I met with the Auditor General.
Right.
And was briefed by him, and then our process going forward. The minister has written to all of the other agencies and ministers around their commitments and ensuring that they take seriously the report and enter their data into Te Haiata by the 30th of June this month. And then our monitoring team is responsible for processing that data and pulling together a report that, as I say, will be ready by the end of this year, calendar year. And then we will continue on this journey, but it's not going to happen overnight.
Can I ask the Minister though, Dave, Minister, have you addressed this with your colleagues? This is incredibly important, as you well know.
Yeah, it's very important.
And are they treating this seriously or not?
The answer to the first question is yes. I have communicated very formally around my expectations, not only when engaging on the whole of system report that was presented to Cabinet in December, but subsequent to that, and in the context of the OAJ report, a letter to ministers. I also have to undertake some bilateral meetings in their course around not just the obligations the Crown has under treaty settlements to various iwi organisations, but also how that in some ways synchronises or better enables the delivery of the government's targets and priorities, because those things don't sit in a mutually exclusive space. Some of them do have some overlap. And for us, of course, we've got government targets and priorities, but we've also got these legal obligations. And if we can do some of those things at the same time, well, hallelujah, amen to that. I'm all about that, because that can help drive some efficiencies. Now, I think that ultimately the ministers have responsibilities, and at that agency level, particularly in, you take, for example, DOC, Director General, very committed to giving effect to Section 4 of the Conservation Act, but also delivering on those obligations set out in various settlement arrangements. Very, very much so. And ultimately enabling a culture within each of the individual agencies that is minded to give effect to treaty principles. But the settlement obligations is very, very important, particularly for DOC, which has by far and away the most obligations of any agency across government around this stuff. So again, I think Dave is very reasonable in saying it's a multi-year sort of effort, and so far, I think it's about 40% of the obligations that have existed have been delivered and completed. There's a whole bunch that are on track and some that have some issues, but the ones that have major issues, that's not 150. That's about 20 that have major issues, and we're dealing with them one by one. Some very well, Kaitai and Woodburn are great examples. Others are a little bit more nuanced, but are definitely identifiable. So the answer is yes, around ministerial commitment or responsiveness to that. That's work on, and that's how it is.
Penny.
Kia ora, Mr. Chair, thank you. I must put on the record, Minister, the disappointment of Ngāpuhi with respect to the comments made by your colleague yesterday regarding sovereignty.
Oh.
So my question to you respectfully with respect to the budget is around the budget that's been allocated for events and the paradox of the position that, well, the more you settle, the fewer the less you need to spend on the kind of engagement to get more Māori settlements across the line. And so my question to you is specifically about the Māori engagements. One, the matrix by which you make your decisions to allocate that money to Māori events, Māori major events and engagement. And two, whether or not you're satisfied that's enough money.
So there's a very small stream of appropriation available for Māori Crown events of significance to Māori Crown nations. Out of that stream, there is some support given to Waitangi Week, and that's marvellous. And not only is that support given through that fund, but there's also some additional support that's given through the Defence Force, which you're very well aware of. There are also opportunities across not just government, but also iwi to conduct events that don't necessarily draw on that very, very small fund. For example, the Matariki funding, that's different for that fund. Other agencies might also undertake events themselves and provide pūtea to enable those events of significance to take place. Do I think that the fund is of a sufficient size in order to accommodate all those events? Well, I'd say, what is the role of that fund? That's the most important thing. The role of that fund is to support events of significance. There is funding there, but it's not a magic money tree either. It's a very, very small fund. And do I think it's the responsibility of multiple agencies to build and conduct relationships in a meaningful mana enhancing, but also a good faith manner to evolve and positively promote Māori Crown relations? Absolutely. It's not just the responsibility of that fund, which is a very, very small fund, to drive those events, but the events which are supported by that fund, in my view, have gone very well. Waitangi Week this year was a great example of that, and there have been some others. And of course, there's one next week.
Yes, Tara or
Māori Pōmare.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those events are spread across the motu, different things, and I look forward to continuing to support those sorts of.
Rima?
Good morning, Morena. I'll just go back to the OAG report with respect to upholding treaty settlement. obligations. You mentioned earlier, Mr. Samuels, that by the 30th of June, there will be some, is it going to be a hui or a report back to you about,
The agencies are
The agency.
responsible for providing the data on settlements into the reporting mechanism.
okay?
And so that's when we analyse that from that time onwards.
And so I'm curious with the analysis that's going to take place, what do you envisage in terms of, do you feel after that report back, you'll be ready to go all guns blazing with following up on these obligations? Or do you, I know that we said it's going to be a bit of a while, but I'm just curious, that first report back, how much is it going to give you insight into what needs to happen next?
Well, it'll give us insights against where we have moved against what the Auditor General has already reported on.
Yeah,
So it'll give us that information, but it'll also provide us with an opportunity to identify how granular is this. Like, for example, one treaty settlement that is not that has not been achieved, if you like, in terms of the commitment, is not the same as another.
yeah.
So counting them both as one is really blunt. And I'm not a data analyst. Adi is here to talk about this, but what I have said is we do need to be really clear about what we're talking about, the significance of the different commitments. There are 14,500 commitments, 14,500, commitments. Yeah, not all of them are the same. And so Te Haiata at the moment provides us with some information, but my push to the staff is, how useful is that? How more do we have to be more granular? And how do we chunk this down to early wins, for example, the big issues, the main gains? You know, how do we do that? And Adi can talk to this as our data specialist.
Thank you.
So one of the things that was recommended by the Auditor General's report was the actual validation of the statuses that are being entered by the Crown agencies. And one of the ways that we're seeking to do that, and was suggested by the Auditor General as well, was to actually seek the views of PSGEs. So the post 30 June activity will include the regional kaimahi getting out into the regions and talking to PSGEs and asking them, based on the analysis that we received through Te Haiata, the reporting tool, actually, are they accurate? Do they agree with what the Crown has considered to be the status of a particular commitment?
Kia ora.
Thank you.
Takutai.
Tēnā kuia. So I'm hearing all the mahi that's being undertaken throughout the department and the new responsibilities. And there's lots of action items identified, and there's that pressure and need to deliver. So how will Vote Māori Development support TPK to grow new capacity and capability across the public service as part of He Korowai Whakapana?
Well, part of the lift and shift, and Dave can corroborate this, has been making sure that the mahi that was undertaken under the Whāinga Amorangi work stream, which is lifting the public service capability in this space, and which dovetailed off statutory provisions in the Public Services Act, I think, Dave, is to make sure that there is some mahi undertaken across different agencies. I think at a very basic level, like legal obligations in those agencies, the settlement obligations is a good indicator of whether or not we've got a set of agencies that are responsive to these issues and that are actually in the zone, because that's a legal obligation. That's not sort of a nice to have, that's actually needs a sort space, and making sure that we've got good ballast and penetration into those issues with the type of confidence is the way that AD, I think, described in different ways, that they are doing it in a way that PSGs and the agencies both can put their hands up and say, yes, that has been done very, very well for each individual obligation. I think that's a good proxy to say whether or not we've seen capability movement across the public service. There may be, and there are other ways to measure that capability lift, and maybe Dave can have a couple of comments on that.
Again, going to the Auditor General on transfer of those responsibilities, we met with the Auditor General, who are doing a an audit, if you like, an audit report on Kāinga Amorangi and how that has progressed. So we get a baseline. And we will be looking at that framework. That framework is one that exists from Te Arawhiti, so that'll be our start point. But with the Auditor General's view on how that has been implemented and the pros and the cons in that regard. But there are some differences that we are looking at, or some areas of improvement and concern. And one is around policy thinking around Māori policy.
Yeah,
And making sure that it's a fundamental baseline for public servants, because it's not at the moment. It's not clear to public servants when we are engaging with Māori, in what capacity is the Māori that we are engaging with operating? Is it as a representative of an iwi? Is it as an individual? And just understanding the different roles that around this table we all play. And knowing as a public servant who we are engaging with and for what purpose. But in terms of the framework, Tarina, do you want to talk more broadly about that? Yeah.
Yeah, so we've had Whānau Ora was implemented in 2020 and has been running through Te Arawhiti for the last 4 years. As Dave and the Minister have spoken about, it has focused very heavily on workforce and capability lift. We're in a position now where we want to think about how do we measure that capability lift and how does that translate into, for example, the relationship strength through settlements work. So part of the Minister's focus on lifting quality and monitoring of the public services, we are looking at how do we measure that 4 years of investment and focus, and whether or not that's the appropriate approach to go now. So that work's been committed. We're committed to looking at that right now.
So can I just add a comment, please, Mr. Chair, in response to Takatai's Pātai, an observation is, and this sort of starts getting into part 2 or tab 2 of our structured agenda.
Yeah.
Having some consistency around the way we apply to Te Tio Waitangi within the public sector is, I think, one of our major priorities. And we use the Tautuhi Orongo framework to enable that, because DOC's a great example, right? Most of the issues that DOC contend with are iwi hapū issues. They're not pan-tribal issues. And if you have an agency that's really in the pan-tribal headspace around, let's say, the management of resources out on Planet DOC, public conservation land, and you've got an agency and its team kaimahi that are really looking through a pan-tribal lens, that's a problem, because DOC land is generally and the responsibilities of DOC at a local level are generally iwi hapū oriented, and looking through a pan-tribal lens, I think, is quite risky. It's more an iwi hapū lens, and making sure that agencies, their teams, the kaimahi across government understand how what lens you look through when dealing with these issues that affect us as Māori or iwi members, has the right lens on. If you've got a concave lens and it's a convex issue, well, there's going to be an issue. You have to get that right in your mind. So strengthening the policy leadership role of Te Puni Kōkiri through to Tautuhi Orongo, making sure we understand how these issues are best approached and understood, I think is very, very important. If we don't get that right, then we do get some Miki Kiore and Miki Rapati sort of results. And I don't think that we've really gripped that up well as governments over time. Sometimes we do it well, and then sometimes it sort of gets a bit confusing. So making sure that there are engagements between Te Puni Kōkiri and other agencies is what Dave and the team are undertaking, having some pilot discussions. And of course, Dave's and the team's advice now do have that lens, Tautuhi Orongo lens, as one of the, I call it, filters sections of the advice that I receive. And I'm sure with all the OIA requests that you guys put in, you'll see that.
We are a little bit over time in this section, but it's an important section. I am going to take one last question before we move on.
Yes.
Can I ask you, Minister, given what's happened with Te Arawhiti, given the limited putia, given that it's still a new entity in many ways, are we wasting our time? Should TPK be the overriding entity, and we just make Te Arawhiti a department of TPK, because there is limited funding. My experience, and I'm sure it'd be, I'd like to hear Dave Samuel's view on this, is that there was always a lot of tripping over each other and getting in the way. And I just asked the question as we round off this kaupapa, are we wasting our time here, and shouldn't we just give TPK the mandate to oversee everything rather than muck around with Te Arawhiti, which is really just getting peanuts from your government?
No, I don't agree.
You don't agree?
With most of what you've said or
Oh.
say.
Okay, we'll move on now.
But the thing is that Te Tari Whakatau, when you rewind to when we both had here in 1994, was set up as the Office of Treaty Settlements. And people like Belinda Clark and others were basically allocated various responsibilities within the Office of Treaty Settlements that sat adjacent to the Ministry of Justice, or Department of Justice, it might have been called then, to really focus on helping to execute treaty settlements between the Crown and iwi. And in some instances, very lucky instances, hapū, like Tūrangi Tukua. And focusing on that role and being really determined to close out some of the remaining settlements, the biggest one of which is Ngāpuhi, but also others like Mōkai Pātea, is the core function of Te Tari Whakatau. And that was the basis of one of the papers that we presented to Cabinet in August last year, to say, actually, if you're trying to cut the deal and then say how it should be implemented afterwards, that has some confusing incentives and drivers, because you're trying to cut a deal on behalf of the Crown and in some ways bad jelly the witch, and tomorrow you're trying to be Santa Claus. Well, I don't think that
I'm
works.
sure Dave will agree with me, wouldn't he?
Yeah, well, we'll get to Dave, but making sure there's clarity on what agency is responsible for what responsibility is at the heart of that paper. Of course, Te Puni Kōkiri has some statutory responsibilities, and usefully, they also synchronise with some of the appetite of the government to drive at targets and priorities, and where suitable, community-led devolution, for want of a better term. And that really came out of Hawatia way back when, 1991, and other various programs. So I don't subscribe to that view, and I don't think it's really your view. I think that might have been just a patsy. But being absolutely clear about the responsibilities is something we should do across all government agencies, but particularly a space which can be quite charged given the inequalities that our communities face, and also some of the shortcomings around the implementation of settlement obligations. We have to be clear, this is the job of Te Tari Whakatau, Te Arawhiti. Do it very, very well. This is the job, or multiple jobs, Te Puni Kōkiri. Do them very, very well. And then we'll be, I think, a lot safer in making sure that we know who's doing what, because what we don't want is a prop masquerading as the first five.
I don't think you want to add any more
I'll
to
just
you,
fucking
Dave.
call out to the backs.
I agree with the minister.
Oh, good.
I'm disappointed.
Yeah.
Good answer, Dave.
But really, until 2017, we were always responsible for the
That's right.
relationship. And having a clear delineation between the one who has got to negotiate away, the liabilities for the Crown in terms of the treaty settlements, and the other agency, my agency, that's responsible, if you look at the Act, to promote increases in the achievements of Māori. Those are quite different responsibilities. I would not want to be going in one day and negotiating hard on a settlement and then going on the next day with the same people and talking about section 5(1)(a) of my Act, which is promoting increases in the levels of achievement. Those are two different things.
Kia ora.
Okay, we'll put on record that the Minister thanks Willie for the patsy. And we'll move on to the next area, which is the government priorities and proposed department spend. So any opening questions in that area? Which side? On the side?
Okay.
Right, yeah, on the side.
Look, I'm interested in the extra funding for Māori wardens. Māori wardens, play such a strong role in many respects. And Minister, if you can walk us through and Mr. Samuels, the reasoning behind that and what you have.
Okay, let's just contextualise what's happened by way of the vote. There's been some reduction in the vote, savings, grants and funding and baseline savings, and time limited funding.
Yes.
Okay, so that's the first thing. So some pūtea total vote in Māori development has come down some. Then there's been some increase in the vote from the commitment that we have made to two fantastic organisations, being the Māori Women's Welfare League, Te Rōpū Wahine Māori Tuku Ora, and the Wātene Māori, the Māori Wardens. And the Māori Wardens already had some funding, and I don't want to get into the operational dynamics of how that lands, but they have effectively been allocated an extra $1.791 million per annum in the baseline. And the function and the role and responsibilities that Māori Wardens undertake, all volunteers, BTW, is very, very visible. So all the big Māori iwi hui that I've been to, whether or not they're the Tangihanga, Kitiuheitia, Kaurangitari Anturi and others, Māori Wardens are there.
Yeah.
You go to other big hui, like Matariki, Puanga and related hui, Māori Wardens are there. Even down at the Frankton markets, Māori Wardens are there. And I actually caught up with Linda Ngata last week down at the Matihiko Awards in Christchurch, and she was there too. Yeah, Papakura Marae. So Māori Wardens are everywhere volunteering and need some pūtea in order to better organise their allocation of roles, responsibilities, coordinating their teams and whatnot. And I think it's absolutely fantastic that's supported by the Deputy Prime Minister. The Minister of Finance is minded to encourage and ultimately agree to an increase for the funding for the Māori Wardens, and we recently had a bit of an announcement in Kirikiriroa, Ki Te Uru, Hamilton West, regarding this matter.
Kusha.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mōrena i te minita o tira koutou katoa, ngā kaimahi e whai ana i te oranga mo tātou te iwi Māori. Minister, we know that the Māori economy is the rock star right now.
Especially farmers.
Hoi anō, wahine Māori contribute 5.9 billion to the economy. Do you have a plan, a specific action plan to maintain and grow that contribution?
Well, the first thing is that there's been some existing vote funding for Māori Women's Development Tama. That's 1.5?
1.5 per annum baseline.
Per annum baselined for NWDI, which I think is a good start to supporting Wahine Māori in business. And those Wahine Māori do some amazing things, and we could rip out some names, whether or not it's Kiri Nathan or Tracy Haupapa, whoever it might be, leaders in their own spheres and leaders of organisations. And one step that we took with the support of the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance was provide some pūtea for the Māori Women's Welfare League, who of course been the ultimate governor owner of Māori Women's Development. So an additional $1.5 million baseline funding over the 4-year budget period. And details are yet to be confirmed around how outcomes outputs from a contractual arrangement can be landed in that respect. I think how you've described Māori women leadership might actually be even understated, Kush, because there are so many Māori organisations that have had phenomenal Wahine Māori leadership, Whānau partnership being one of them with Dame Ingrid Collins, but others that we're all aware of. And certainly from our view, making sure we continue to sponsor and support Māori women into board appointed positions by the government is top of mind, and I don't think if anyone around this table, well, maybe some of you intelligent ones know that 27% of all board appointments by the government are Māori, and 15 of that 27% are Māori women. So, in terms of appointments from the board, recognising the competencies and capabilities of Māori women by way of the government appointed board members, and don't forget we appoint, I think it's 850 boards every year, as a demonstration of the ongoing, no matter who's running government, appreciation and acknowledgement of that capability and capacity set.
Ka pai, and Dame Marita is very pleased with you, Minister, for getting Māori Women's Welfare League into the budget.
Noted, I'll see her at church.
With that, you know, you mentioned the word continue. So the statistics you've said yourself, we still need to grow them. Are you committing to future investment to grow that capacity?
Well, I think there's significant investment already, but we've got to really, I think as a government and as a country, recognise how community-led, whānau-centred organisations can actually better deliver many public services, and many of those are actually led by wahine Māori, whether or not that's some of the Whānau Ora providers out there or other organisations, and making sure that not only is there something specific like the allocation and baseline to Māori Women's Welfare League or NWDI, but really driving at that community led whānau-centred kaupapa. It's not just Whānau Ora, but there's a whole range of organisations, and supporting better, more effective delivery of public services with organisations that are led by Māori women. I'm right behind that, whether or not that's people like Lady Tudati or others who do some amazing things in the community. So I think what you're saying is, will you have more funding or appropriation specifically towards wahine Māori? I think where we've landed is good for now, but importantly, on that other space, which is better delivery of, or more effective delivery of public services by local organisations which are led by wahine Māori. Absolutely, I'm all for that. Dave?
One of our responsibilities, and I have touched on it, is, say it word for word because it's quite important, under our Act, is to monitor and liaise with those agencies who are responsible for services to and for Māori, to ensure the adequacy of those services. That's section 5(1)(b). And it's a statutory function. That's a function that hasn't been done by Te Puni Kōkiri for some time, that we're reinvigorated after the August Cabinet papers. Part of that, my expectation from particularly my monitoring team, Terina and co, is to make sure when we look at who is being serviced by those public service agencies, we don't just look at Māori, we look at the wider whānau, including wahine Māori.
Yeah. Can I just double up or triple down on those comments? You know, you take a point, it's nice with this graph, it's at some of the drivers of housing projects that are being undertaken across the country. So in Yorohe, for example, in Dennis, the Toitu Tairawhiti kaupapa at Tūranga Tangatarite, adjacent to the hospital, specifically announced by none other than, I don't know if it's honourable, Willie Towell, but definitely Matua Willie, really focused on single wahine Māori with kids. So at that edge of provision of housing by Māori housing providers, we are getting very direct messaging that actually this is around driving tautoko for wahine who have kids in a very difficult space. Unfortunately, in that incident, it's adjacent to a hospital and healthcare. And I'm really motivated and inspired by that type of commitment to wahine Māori, particularly those that are quite exposed to some of the vagaries of the economic situation and social situation that we have. I find that when we cut through a lot of the bureaucracy speak, at the community end, there is a lot of drive and a lot of motivation around whānau, particularly wahine leading those whānau. Now, other people might have a different slant on things and a different, Steve, kia ora, mate. Stop singing everywhere. Might have a different view on that, and that's kate pai. But my view is that when I peel back the layers of the onion and the banana, I find that at that level of actual facilitation of outcomes, it's led by wahine. What we do have in the housing space, though, is a serious challenge around older wahine Māori, 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, who have some very dire housing circumstances and are unable to afford rent, unable to afford their own home. And that's a massive housing, a massive challenge and opportunity for those involved in the housing space, particularly Minister Bishop and myself and Louise Upston.
You mentioned the value of wahine in the whānau. You know, for many of us, it was our mothers who were the role models in terms of the workforce. And you've mentioned many great wahine who've risen to positions of leadership in Aotearoa. But at the end of the day, wahine Māori still earn 20% less. What specifically are you doing to address that?
Well, I think that pay gap, is how it's described often by people, is real genuine, and I've tried to make sure that we're really clear and transparent about the pay gap, but also the drivers around that pay gap, and to figure out, okay, how can we deal at a macro level with some of the major economic issues so we can ensure that the wages or the salaries of wahine Māori rise along with the rest of the economy in a faster way than the inflation and the cost of living rises. Have we done enough in that space to specifically attack that pay gap for wahine Māori? I think we could do a lot more and be a lot more targeted. At the macro level, we're just trying to get things moving again, like infrastructure opportunities and, rolling back some of the regulatory thicket that's stopping projects from happening. But do we need to do better or more? Yes, the answer is yes. What do I need to do in order to help give effect to that? Well, first, be transparent about the stats. That's the mahi that our Data Jedi 80 and others are undertaking. What is something specific? Well, we've got that stuff happening with NWDI and Māori Women's Welfare League, but 3 million a year ain't necessarily going to move the dial. What other things can we do? Well, that's something that ultimately I need to get better advice on and go from there.
So it's on your agenda?
It's definitely an issue that I think of not once a year. I get that regularly from my daughter. What are you doing? Which isn't comfortable for me. Let alone my wife. But it is an agenda issue. Is it at the top of the list of things that we have to contend with? It should be nearer to the top.
Okay, we'll move to Takutai. Ka te anoa. Just following on from a strategy for wahine, Māori have a very youthful young population.
Yes.
1 in 3 under 25. What strategies do you have for our rangatahi to bring them through the system, to grow their young minds, to build that capacity across the department?
So look, I think the first thing is just to go back to some of my earlier statements in the sense that there's not a lot of financial resource relatively within the department compared to the rest of government, right? And I think I mentioned before, less than 1%, I think it's less than 0.5% of the total vote goes into Māori development. So the capacity for us to do things in a macro and material way through program support or through funding support is very minimal compared to, let's say, education or other votes, which is a lot bigger. That's the first thing. The second thing, and going back to the cabinet paper from August last year, it's the responsibility of Te Puni Kōkiri to hold these other agencies to account, particularly given some of the demographic stats which you've accurately portrayed. So what that means in practice is making sure, first of all, we're very, very transparent about the stats that continue to show disproportionate impact on Māori, whether or not we're under 24s or housing or other things. So for example, the NEET situation, not an employment, education or training for Māori is pretty dire, particularly in a place like Tāmaki Makaurau, very, very challenged. And for us, we don't necessarily find it easy to address that specifically. Where we come at it, for Te Puni Kōkiri's purposes, is being very transparent about the data and the monitoring and showcasing some of the success stories around how to re-engage needs into educational training or employment. And I think that ultimately, many of the agencies don't have a real grasp on how there's so many successful programs and work streams that have been undertaken at a community level, but also randomly by government agencies and philanthropic organisations to help engage those young people. And part of the role of Te Puni Kōkiri, particularly the regional kaimahi, is to showcase and demonstrate that actually there are solutions within our communities around some of the confronting issues that our young people face. But if you take a great example, school attendance, right? And the school attendance for Māori Term 3 2023, or Term 4, sorry, it's 33%. And that's shocking. If our rangatira mokopuna aren't going to school, that has very severe macro consequences later on. So now December Term 4 2024 went from 33 in 23 to 44 in Term 4 2024. And my expectation and impress upon Dave is to make sure that with the mahi that's been undertaken by Minister Seymour and others to help incentivise or drive those numbers and ensure that more Māori kids go to school, more than 44% go to school, is very optimally informed by success stories. Because if you say there's only one way we're going to do it, this is the way, we're going to go out there and, you know, do it this way to get Māori kids to school, without having that granularity and advice from various initiatives around getting Māori to school, I don't think that that's good public policy practice or good implementation of the aspiration to have 80% of kids attending school on a regular basis. So what does that mean? That sounds like gobbledygook to me. When I see what happened at Opotiki College with these kids that Dana knows about, the member, there are 15 to 20 kids, young people, 14 to 16 years old. They were at school to build houses for their whānau. That's why they go to school. They weren't going to school for any other reason, but they were inspired and motivated by the fact that Whakatōhea had a contract to build 20 houses on the east coast for their whānau, and these kids were engaged to go to school and build houses for their whānau. Well, I think that's awesome because they learn about maths, they learn about project management and everything else. And the role of Te Puni Kōkiri in bringing up those and showcasing those successful experiences is very, very important. It's easy for me in some ways because my kids are at boarding school. They can't go anywhere but school. But for many, many tens of thousands of Māori kids, that's not the case. So I think just in that specific example around kids' attendance at school, the role of Te Puni Kōkiri is to showcase what really works, particularly in those schools which are formally deciles 1 to 5, where most Māori kids are, and to show that actually there are some very, very successful examples. You look at Te Rūnanga o Kirikiriroa, sorry, Te Wharekura o Kirikiriroa, led by Tony Boy and his whānau down there. 80 to 90% attendance for a decile 1 school. Why? Why is it that good? TPK has to tell the ministry, this is why this is the case, and this is a pathway to success. And it's not always the same everywhere around the country. There are different drivers that can enable young people's success.
We've got 3 members wanting to ask questions. I've only got about 8 minutes left, so could I please ask people to be succinct in their questions? So Willie.
maybe you could ask the minister to be succinct. But, with respect, of course. You've, I certainly can see your commitment, Minister, to kaupapa Māori. Don't doubt that at all. Don't doubt that for 1 second, actually. However, the facts say that you're failing at the moment in terms of targeted funding for Māori. In your Minister Cabinet paper entitled Government Action Plan to Support Māori Economic Development, it states that Māori economic growth is a portfolio priority for the Māori Development Portfolio. And it's focused on improving wealth amongst iwi Māori and New Zealand generally. And that's absolutely spot on. Problem is we've got a decrease right across the portfolio. So a couple of questions, and if you could be succinct, because I've got a number of other questions too. You've had this decrease in terms of Māori funding, targeted funding across the portfolio, and you have a Deputy Prime Minister who believes funding us is racist. Clear as a bell. Said that in terms of Māori television and Māori radio, and it's been on public media too. So how are you dealing with that? Because we can hear your commitment. I don't think anyone here would doubt your commitment to kaupapa Māori and to our people. But you have a Deputy Prime Minister undermining you at the moment. Have you dealt with that? Have you got a plan going forward? How do you traverse that area, given your commitment, given your department's commitment? Is there hope for Māori, given where your Deputy Prime Minister lies, where his views lie?
Well, I think there are a number of views in that commentary, and there might have been a question.
The question is, have you dealt with the Deputy Prime Minister?
And there was a reflection on a view of one of my colleagues that funding, Māori funding is racist. I don't share that view. I have a different view, and I'd really appreciate everyone in this meeting whose friends are journalists actually to amplify my view. Because what often happens is that certain views are given some really enhanced coverage, and others that I think are just as legitimate are not. So first thing is that we have a very important series of commitments emanating out of Te Tiriti o Waitangi and the Treaty of Waitangi, whether or not those are commitments around good kāwanatanga or rangatiratanga or ōrītitanga, however tangas we might want to refer to. And that provides a very constitutional bedrock for our existence as a country. It amplifies and reflects on things that were already existing. That's the first thing. The second thing is that when you consider the very disproportionate circumstances that our communities face, and the fact, and I mentioned this before in my response to Takatai's question about young people, that within us we have a lot of responses and answers and solutions to those disproportionalities. So, for example, gave that Te Wharekura Kiriakirerua reference around high attendance numbers in a decile 1 type arrangement. And part of that is motivated by cultural connection between the kaiako and the rangatei and their whānau, but also the motivation that comes with kids going to wharekura in that particular area, 5 Crossroads in Hamilton. It's very consistent with my way of thinking that funding those with solutions and outcomes for the targets and priorities that the government had is actually not necessarily a convenient thing to do, it's a prudent thing to do. So when you come down to how do we resolve o tautoko whānau and hapū iwi Māori organisations that are geared towards delivering solutions in our community that are actually probably in some ways better than the government delivering the solution, actually I'm all for that.
Right.
Why did we give money to the Māori Women's Welfare League and the Māori Women's? Because we actually believe that there is a way to do that. So whilst there's been a comment.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Yeah, the minister's giving very long-winded questions. We've got 4 minutes left.
So you got a quick say?
Yeah,
Well, thank you,
look,
and thank you for turning up late. So
Point of
what
order,
Hold
I
on, hold on, we're chewing up time with this, please stop.
Yeah.
I would
Yeah.
just respectfully ask, because Steve is
Turn
right.
up on time.
Order. the minister's not answering he's barely addressing the question. We want to know how he's dealing with the Deputy Prime Minister's strategy in terms of undermining and actually being successful in knocking out Māori funding.
Well, no,
And
no,
you
no.
have not given us one answer or any
What I've said is
reflection on
this.
that.
Okay, we've got the
Well, no,
question.
what I've said is this, is that there's a number of people, not just in this room, but in this precinct, that have different views. The Deputy Prime Minister and I don't share a view around that particular kaupapa. I have a different view. And I've given a context as to where my view
Yep.
comes from.
And that was the
also
answer that I heard.
Something
what he
that's,
responded.
something
Thank you,
that's,
Have you got a quick
yeah,
sum?
something that sits
Well-
consistently with this government's focus, which is delivering better public services as well as getting the economy back on track.
Thank you, Minister. Quick sum?
Can I just want to ask about a couple of the programs because, we've had, how can Māori then, given that position, have confidence in you, given that our targeted funding is being cut back, procurement, which you know all about, having been involved in that, it's been cut back. We've got Māori, we've got treaty clauses, Minister, that are being knocked right out. How can we have confidence in you as a minister when that type of strategy is happening with this government? All Māori initiatives are being attacked by the Deputy Prime Minister, and he has a clear strategy on that. How do we, and I appreciate what you're saying, but what is the strategy? How can you give Te Ao Māori some confidence,
Well, I
Minister
think,
Potaka?
you have to be careful, Mr. Chair, dressing up opinions as facts. I think the view that all Māori initiatives have been
I
under
didn't say
attack
all, I didn't say
is
all.
unreasonable and inaccurate. That's the
Didn't
first
say
thing.
all.
No, you did say all Māori initiatives.
Well, if I
The
did
second
say,
thing-
if I did say all, I'd say many, let me,
Okay,
many Māori initiatives have been
And some of those
attacked, which you would
initiatives-
agree with, I'm
And some of
sure.
those initiatives don't sync with the direction of travel this government is undertaking. Now, the view that all clauses, all initiatives are under attack, okay, we've cleared that up and you're saying many. There are some things that we actually think are going to be better delivered through having very targeted kaupapa oriented funding. And this government and I as the minister are in a space where we've got serious fiscal issues. And I don't need to belabor that, but taking the debt up from 5 billion to 100 billion did not help over 5 or 6 years prior to us coming in. The second thing is that all agencies have basically cut back except for health, education, defence and police. All agencies have had to take a haircut. That includes my agencies and Department of Conservation, Te Puni Kōkiri, and housing. The view that we don't have confidence because your agency has less money than last year, I think is misplaced given the fiscal context. What we are really focused on, and you made mention of the Māori Development Fund, is tilting the support within the Māori Development Fund towards economic development, rather than bits and bobs all over the place with different funding drivers. We are definitely driving into Māori economic development. That should be no surprise, given where the government is basically focused its attention, which is getting the economy back on track, supplemented by law and order and public services.
Okay, we're
issues.
going to close this section out with a final question from Steve. Steve.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Minister, the Māori development budget on the whole is a smaller budget by comparison to others. And yet this budget's been cut by 9.5%, which is greater than the 6.5% the minister was expecting of all ministries. Is that consistent with the bias of this government that has a suite of anti-Māori, anti-treaty legislation? Or is it a reflection of a failure on your part as minister to advocate successfully?
Well, I
And
think
secondly, I'll just do a follow-up. How do you deal with the demoralisation amongst the ministry officials and staff in the
Okay.
context of a government that clearly has such a negative view of targeted investment in Māori development?
let's clear up some of the disinformation you've inculcated in this hui. The 9.6% decrease is made up of 4.8%, which was time-limited funding, which was committed to by a government you supported in 2020, 2023 as the Green Party. So let's get that straight. There was time-limited funding. It's coming out of the budget. That was time-limited, and when you had a
But in government,
Labor-led
you can
majority
extend it.
government that didn't put it in the baseline, that's actually on you as a Labor-Green coalition. Second thing is this, is that all agencies, I think except Defence, Police health and education have had, as you described it, a bigger cut than the savings, 4.8%, that's gone through the Māori Development portfolio. And I'm actually very proud of the kaimahi that sit alongside me and beside me for the work that they do out in the communities. The third thing, which is in response, I think, to your conjecture around how the government is basically anti-Māori, I think is very misplaced.
Demoralisation of staff.
I don't hear that from the staff. I actually think, especially the staff in my office, they love working for me in 4.4.
Okay, I think, we're going to take a break.
Yeah, 3.5 straight, no stopping.
So what time's that pohuri tomorrow? 4 o'clock.
I'm at 12:30, I'm off.
You driving from here?
Yeah, 12:30, I've got to go.
You can't fly, eh? Around.
No, there's no fly unless you get a helicopter. There's no flights. Waidu only has like a very unusual arrangement.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there's no flights,
So 3.5, no stop. Okay.
no stop.
Righto, we'll draw the meeting to order again, please.
As part of my koha to the committee, I brought some emergency chocolate. And I'll deliver these by hand.
Well, while you're doing that, I'm sure that you can receive a question when we start this next section, which is on the housing initiative funding. We've actually got 40 minutes. I'm trying to get through the next 3 sections slightly quicker so that we can leave a bit more time for the last 2 areas that we've got here, okay? So housing initiative funding, have we got any opening questions from the side of the?
I have when the minister's finished.
Now, bribes.
This is not an adjustment.
Did you clear this?
Thanks,
Is the other one? Oh, no, this is dark chocolate.
It's ready. It's the biggest thing.
You're listening, eh, Tama? This is a check, okay.
Okay. Okay. Oh, well, kia ora tātou. We're into housing.
Housing initiative, yep.
In terms of the homelessness area, obviously this kaupapa is incredibly important. So I just want to the recent announcement in Rotorua. Can you just give us a little bit of an elaboration on that? How were Māori providers catered for with regards to that kaupapa? I have heard different amu in terms of Ngāti Whakaue being factored out. Maybe you could give us some elaboration there because obviously it's a good thing, Minister. Congratulate you on that. I think it's too far away, but still not going to criticise a kaupapa that's incredibly important for our people in Te Arawa. But how were the Māori providers of Te Arawa accommodated in that process, Minister?
Okay, context, Rotorua is one of the most deprived places for housing in the country, along with Tairāwhiti and Northland. There are pockets of housing deprivation severe everywhere, but those areas are very, very deprived. There's been a huge effort over many years to support more housing to be deployed into Rotorua, particularly in light of the serious emergency housing situation and the lack of Kāinga Ora building in Rotorua over the last 10 years. Recently, there was an announcement around government support for 189 new homes to be built in Rotorua. 150 through community housing providers. Determination on who, yet to be finalised. I expect that there will be some Māori housing providers, Māori chips, that will be included in delivering some of those 150 homes. Those 150 come out of the 1,500 IRS funded places for community housing providers in budget 24. 10% of budget 24 community housing provision commitments are for Rotorua. Separately, there's 39 houses to be built, closed out by Ōwhata 2B and 7D, a Ngāti Whakaue related organisation because they are Ngāti Rangatiratanga. They are Whakaue. They will build and close out 39 houses in Kotu. So the announcement was over at Ōwhata, but those houses that they will build under this announcement are in Kotu, 39. There is another kaupapa going on there related to 18 houses, related to local iwi and hapū. That would be for another day, but that's another 80 homes. And again, that's a TBC to be finalised, and I look forward to an announcement in due course. The view that Whakaue and others have not been included in this does not sit comfortably with my understanding of everything that's been undertaken with the Rotorua Housing Plan.
Can I just ask, is that the first
And-
time you've heard that?
No,
No, you've already heard.
no. But I have acknowledged it as a view, but I do not believe that that view is accurate given what I've described. The 150, I expect that Māori housing providers will be involved in those discussions. The 39 is a whakaue organisation, albeit at a whānau trust level. And there's another 80 that are being finalised right now with an iwi-related organisation. And the housing plan between the council, iwi and hapū, particularly whakaue, and stakeholders is underway.
Because, yeah, I do have some, because, so I'm glad, Minister, that you have heard that view. And that's the view that has been given to me, that the local tribe has been factored out.
I think that's unfair.
You
I think that's unfair,
Yeah,
given what I've just described.
Yeah, and
there's still space to
I
get involved.
appreciate your response, but it does bring to the table the question about why you abandoned Kāinga, Oranga, when we have the infrastructure in place, when it is a clear strategy of by Māori for Māori, when it has been incredibly successful across the country. Our people will see that you have betrayed a kaupapa that is that has been so successful, and they can't get their heads around it, that you would betray a kaupapa and open up competition that now that Māori providers have to compete with mainstream providers. Very unfair. It's already been proven that in the past, and now that opportunity has been opened up in terms of mainstream providers. How do you support, or were you overwhelmed again by David Seymour in this area? Did David Seymour get his way? Why you would abandon such a successful program like Kāinga, Oranga?
First, I want to mihi to the architects of Kāinga, Oranga and the leaders like Kararaina Kaukara and others across the public sector space who were instrumental in facilitating and enabling successful delivery of homes against Kāinga, Oranga. Absolutely outstanding. Of course, 1,000 homes endorsed under the Labour-led government, some of which are yet to be built, 1,000 under the national government in the last 18 months, many of which are yet to be built, but that's 2,000 homes, and also over and above that, some of the repairs work and training and other things. That's the first thing. The second thing is that at the core of all housing mahi are whānau in need. Right at the interface of delivering public services better, no matter if it's government or Māori housing providers or others, is making sure whānau, particularly for me, whānau Māori, are given, are enabled to have adequate housing. That's the rights as enunciated by international covenants. It's enunciated through Bill of Rights documents and a whole range of other things. The pūtea that was allocated within Te Puni Kōkiri for papa kāinga and repairs and training, some of that has gone back to MHUD around the iwi prototypes, and MHUD's best to engage with them. Some of that has been savings that's been removed from the Te Puni Kōkiri budget. Te Puni Kōkiri still has budget around papa kāinga and repairs and training. That continues, and that is, I think it's just over 35 million? 34 and a half, Swedish rounding. 35 million per annum for papa kāinga and other things. The Kāinga, Oranga budget, which you've referred to, and I think which has caused a lot of deep concern around how that budget has moved into something different. I just want to address that issue now. A whole range of funds across government and in the housing space have been effectively centralised and reallocated across projects. in terms of the Kāinga Whāoranga budget that is effectively be centralised and reallocated, some of that was the 200 million announced for 400 or more new homes, as I announced in Waitangi Week. That includes the 150 homes that are being built right now by Wili Te Aho and Aniwehi and others at Toitu Tairāwhiti in Gisborne, and a whole range of other homes. So they're building 150, a whole range of other homes and sites across the Motu, including up in Kaitaia and Rotorua and Central North Island and other places. So 200 million of the Kāinga Whāoranga budget that you referred to that has been centralised has been allocated for new housing across those areas. And there's a number of projects in relation to the same. Some of the pūtea has been used to shore up the cost pressures that were not accommodated by previous governments around housing first, transitional housing, and other provision of housing support, which disproportionately affects whānau Māori. There was no cost pressure protection for a lot of those programs by way of previous budgets. And this government has had to use a range of funding, centralised and then reallocated to protect the cost pressures and actually deliver funding for many, many whānau Māori who live in those transitional houses and those housing first, rapid rehousing and other related arrangements. So going back to the kernel of what we're here to do is to actually tautoko whānau Māori and ensuring that there is adequate housing support for them. So some of the Māori around the development space, which you're referring to, Kāinga Whāoranga funding, has actually been tipped into a space where a lot of Māori are accommodated in housing first, transitional and other homes. In addition, social housing in Auckland, which I think we all know is disproportionately Māori. And finally, a flexi fund, which has been referred to in the housing debates and other kōrero here in this precinct. The flexible fund will give flexibility around how different organisations, including Māori organisations, can access funding that may not have already been accessible. For example, some Māori organisations which aren't CHIPS, I expect the flexible fund will include criteria which enables them to access IRS equivalent funding. So what does that mean? Ultimately, there is some funding that's gone in to help whānau Māori on another side where there have been cost pressures which have not been addressed. Social housing in Auckland, which is disproportionately a number of Māori, whānau Māori who need social housing, and a flexible fund which will enable different forms of funding to Māori organisations that are not CHIPS, because all the Kāinga Whāoranga funding basically was going into affordable rentals. Now it's going to be affordable rentals, IRS, and maybe some other things as well. And some of the Māori organisations, development organisations, iwi prototypes and others, are trying to create mixed tenure developments, but have only been able to access affordable rental funding through Kāinga Whāoranga, and then had to go around to different agencies trying to sign up to different types of funding. So yes, acknowledge huge work by Kāinga Whāoranga over many years, yet to be closed out. Some of the iwi prototypes, and of course we've got the chairperson or former chairperson of one of them here today. Fantastically. That, along with a whole bunch of other funding, centralised, reallocated, some of which specifically for Māori housing developers, some of which to protect the situation that a lot of Māori whānau live in.
Would you accept that it's a lot tougher now for Māori providers, given the change of policy in terms of this government now having to contest with mainstream providers?
Well, the criteria are yet to be determined around the flexible funding, and my advocacy is that it leans heavily into Māori providers and gives them a broader suite of funding options through one doorway. Secondly, I think it's important to contextualise that question around, is it going to be harder for whānau Māori to get adequate housing as a result of this decision? I think that's yet to be seen. And as I described it, when you have a previous budget arrangement, when there is no cost pressure protection, a whole bunch of housing that accommodates whānau Māori It's probably too early to tell.
650 million, I think we worked out, being transferred out of Kāinga, Whānau over the last 2 years. Dave might be able to give us the exact number. I'm not sure. It's around that number. You're the minister responsible for the biggest transfer of money from Māori to mainstream in the history of ministers. How did you deal with that? I'm sure that that wouldn't have been your preference when this kaupapa was put up at cabinet.
Well, I think we have to be careful around fuzzy math. 200 million of a number, that is not the number that I think is how you describe it, but $200 million of that number has been recommitted straight into into Māori housing providers. That's 200 million announced at Waitangi Week, of which the Tūranga Tangata Rite is the first 50 million. So I think we just have to be careful about presenting those numbers and being very, very accurate with those numbers. Secondly, what's at the heart of what we're trying to make sure of is those whānau who have genuine housing need and the right house in the right place is deployed and delivered for those whānau with genuine housing need. And I think that ultimately we've made choices. I really respect and celebrate the mahi that successful, credible Māori housing providers have done. And I've had the great chance to visit, many of whom were supported under the previous government, Tine Māori Ora, and under this government, Māori Ora kia tatu. And I continue to support them. Now that they've got the ability, I think, to access a more agile fund through one doorway, that is an upside and it's something that they asked for. We still do have some pūtea and Scrutiny kōkiri around Kāinga, and it was really pleasing for me to hear that your father-in-law's brother got some support down at Kokohina.
Thank you very much for that. Look after the relations. So just in summary, Minister, you're saying by Māori, for Māori, still in place,
By Māori,
but
for Māori.
in a different context. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is by Māori, for Māori, I'm absolutely supportive of that, particularly where it's credible. By Māori, for everyone, I'm massively supportive of that because I think that many of the Māori housing providers can compete with any random developer out there, including Kāinga Ora. And at our cost base within those Māori providers, as you know, in many locations, is considerably less than Kāinga Ora because we don't have all the corporate cost base that goes with it, number one. And number two, a lot of the Māori housing providers use our own whenua Māori to enable that, and that comes at a different cost compared to other pieces of land. And number three, and this is something that I just wanted to acknowledge, member Whānau Linden for, when you have a development such as that at Kāinga Hoa Marae out at Rāwhiti, where you have old houses that are spruced up under the repairs, you have new houses that are built, and the marae gets a revamp of the whole septic arrangement, in my view, that is a beautiful thing.
Okay, we'll move to Kushla.
Kia ora noi te Minister. Looking at rangatahi transitional housing now and the damage getting rid of that has had. Recently, visited Te Hiwa Mahaki in Marae Nui, who have 34 rangatahi on their books, and for such a small community, that is a big number. Iwi social services nearby are at capacity. So number one, what are your medium-term plans to resolve that? And what hope can you offer these rangatahi? Because Kāinga Oranga is such a good name because when you've got a home, you've got hope, you're set up for life. But in the meantime, what immediate hope can you give to these rangatahi and their whānau and relief to the services who are trying to help them? And what is your medium and long-term plan to address this?
Well, I think ultimately, there are a lot of rangatahi with very serious housing deprivation. Some have had dislocation from their whakapapa and their whānau. Some are in very tight situations. And of course, the economy's very, very challenged. And it links in with the comments by Takutai earlier on around hope for young people. The second thing is that the rangatahi there continue to be youth transitional and rangatahi supported accommodation places throughout the housing portfolio, but that's not the portfolio or the Kāinga Whāoranga funding. That's a different.
No, but I was saying the name
allocation.
is good because that's what housing provides you, and these rangatahi don't have that.
Yeah, but that is a different portfolio. That's not through the Kāinga Whāoranga funding that Minister Matua Willie has described. But I acknowledge that there is serious housing deprivation with rangatahi, but it's not in the funding that's appropriated either through Te Puni Kōkiri or through the Kāinga Whāoranga fund. It's something that sits in the housing portfolio.
What's your view on it though?
Well, I think my view is very clear. There's serious housing deprivation with many, many rangatahi, and we do have to work smarter and quicker around a lot of those challenges. Certainly, I've had the fortunate privilege of meeting people like Mahera Mahi and others who are in this space and doing it tough. A lot of the rangatahi doing it real tough. And part of, I suppose, my personal mojo is making sure we have stronger whānau tautoko. But I do want to say too that Whānau Ora should not be a proxy for trying to get in and solve everyone's housing problems, because it's got its own responsibilities and kaupapa, and we'll talk about those this afternoon. So I don't disagree. There's a lot of people, young people doing it hard, a lot of people doing it hard. That's my comments around older wahine Māori as well, which I made earlier on. We do need a better, cheaper way to build houses, and that's why Minister Bishop at the macro level was so geared towards going for housing growth, zoning and consenting arrangements. That's why I'm geared towards Papa Kāinga and having a national standard and enabling 10 houses to be built on Māori land as a permitted activity without having to go to a resource consent. I just need to make sure the Māori land court's on the same page as me and in the same waka. We are trying to do things, so many things, to make it easier to build houses. So when we face up to the reality that it's 50% more cost to build a house here compared to Australia, that ain't good, because our wages aren't like Australia. That is not good. And we have to also contend with a whole bunch of other things, like our land often being in a different ground condition to Australia. That's rock, this is swamp and next bush. So you've got all these situations, and the seismic laws, all these situations in New Zealand that are making it harder to build homes. And Huana and others, and you all probably have been involved in building homes. It takes forever and a day to get things done. We just want to make it easier to build homes to accommodate our whānau. And there are, of course, concerns around the funding. We're really geared around the regulatory, and I think the public Kāinga standard is going to be very good for our people.
Okay, Huana?
Yeah, just a quick sup on Matua Willie. So recognising some of the impediments part-time and the opportunity through this new Papa Kāinga standard that could come into play. It's the Flexible Housing Fund, and is there going to be a dedicated Māori dollar within it so that there's a knowledge within the Māori housing sector by Māori for Māori? So this is by Māori for Māori, not by Māori for everyone. Is there a proviso within that dollar that we know there's a carve out of pūtea for by Māori for Māori?
There's no intention of a carve out, but what the intention is to have a tilting or an inflection that recognises the credible experiences of Māori organisations in developing housing for our own whānau, but importantly, the disproportionate levels of severe housing deprivation amongst Māori, whether or not that's the numbers in emergency, 60, 65, sometimes 85% in some towns like Rotorua, or Kāinga Ora on the waiting list, 45 to 50% Māori, and of course those that are living in Kāinga Ora about 30 to 35%. So there is no carve-out tag, but there's an absolute appreciation that the disproportionate arrangements for Māori in housing, look at the number of Māori that own our own house. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. And the fact is, what I see, those Māori housing developers that are very credible in delivering homes got a bit of momentum. And it's not just, the Pauahis or the Toitus of the world. There's actually a lot of Māori house builders like Leon De Silva up in Waikato or Maui Wepu up in Auckland that are doing a phenomenal job. Ultimately, are we dealing with the issues on the ground with whānau, Māori and others in need? And it's clear to me there's a whole range of things that aren't being dealt to in a expeditious manner. Hence, you've got Minister Bishop in the Going for Housing Growth and everything that goes with it. Chris Pink, 250,000 products that are going to be credentialised any moment, as well as the infrastructure funding and financing, the consenting arrangements, and ultimately a very, very clear intention around identifying the right place for the right home for those in genuine need. And that's what I'm geared around. And that's why you've seen me flying the flag, not just in this building, but particularly in Hamilton West, for all those Māori kids that have been living in dank motels and getting 3,000 kids out of motels. I'm very proud of it.
Yeah, just on top of that, Minister, wanting to follow through on whenua Māori in particular and how to whakamahia whenua Māori, because TPK has been a great source of support in that space.
Well, thank you.
So for that, you're welcome. But because you've provided a suite of tools, right, to whenua Māori landowners and administrators. So for Papa Kāinga purposes and housing aspirations for Māori and ahu whenua trusts, you know, that type of thing, is there an ability or is there a space again, whether it's a carve out or not, within that flexible housing fund for whenua Māori? Because don't we want our land to be productive and giving back to the people and their descendants?
While there's no specific intention around let's say a tag for Māori funding within the flexible, for Māori housing within the flexible fund, there is funding for Papa Kāinga and other related group like repairs work and whatnot that exists at Te Puni Kōki.
Yeah.
That exists.
Yeah.
Within the flexible fund, no intention, but every intention to recognise where the need is, which is disproportionately Māori, and also the credibility of housing developers like Whānau Ora, who have been doing some wonderful things on the ground addressing that need, and also a whole range of other challenges like, you know, single mums with kids up in Gisborne, which is the key focus for the Tūranga Tangata Rite development. So I do think that, I don't think that there's any polarisation of the debate within this cohort of kōrero, and there is an absolute intention to make sure any funding that's public funding is geared towards those with need, disproportionately Māori, and in a context where we're trying to simplify, not just building on land generally, but particularly Māori land, because people want to use our whenua for legitimate purposes, reconnecting people to the whenua, but also enabling jobs. And when I see what Luka Moana Shelf Housing and others did up at Tauwhare Pa recently, where they've got some horticulture and they've moved some houses onto that site with the help of a church group up in Tāmaki, I forget their name. I look at that and say, that is marvellous. You've got the marae over there, you've got some horticulture here, now you've got housing. What's that? That's whenua. Ditto Orwhata 2B and 7D, which I was at on Sunday, where they're building 93 homes, some affordable rentals, some to be owned by whānau on their whānau trust land, adjacent to shops and job opportunities, and around the corner from the marae, where I go and speak to the nanas, the koike that are living in those homes. This is Sunday just gone at about 12 o'clock. And say, how are you going? They're like, we're absolutely loving this, because not only have we got an affordable rental, we can actually go to our waiata practice every other week down at the marae, and they're re-engaged and reconnected. Now, there are some places in the country that are way out in the proverbial sticks, beautiful places like Rafiti, and I go up there and see what's going on, and I'm saying, well, that's a marvellous example where kāwanatanga can tautoko the aspirations of the ground of the haupainga and the ahika and the rangatira on the ground. And I'd dearly love to see more of that, such as what Ngāti Rangi, we're all going up there tomorrow, are doing up in Oahu, and hopefully at some stage where Takutai and I have some bones and places like Taiapi.
Kia ora.
Okay, we've got three members with questions.
Sorry, that was a bit of long-winded description, but as you know, I'm really G'd up about housing.
Yes, we can see that.
Got it.
You're triggering me, Mr. Jackson. Triggering me. Yeah. There's great vision for Whānau Ora.
Great.
So this is, I mean, in some ways you've already covered this, Minister, but I just wanted to give one more opportunity to speak about Māori housing development in the broader context of the government's focus on addressing housing needs across the spectrum. So you touched before briefly on some of the things that, for example, Bishop Minister Pink speak on. Are there more things that you'd speak in that actually relate to your responsibilities?
Well, ultimately, I'm really motivated to make sure that those whānau in need, the many tens of thousands of whānau, Māori and others actually, in need, get a chance for adequate housing. we do have to review how the social allocation system and other things operate within housing, because you have quite unusual situations. I'll give you a great example. Similar whānau, living in the same place. One's in social housing, might be Kāinga Ora or Chip, and they pay $120 a week. And someone who hasn't had that opportunity isn't, gone through the system and been selected, they're paying $480 a week, but they're in the same economic situation. And we find that to be quite unusual and something that we actually have to look at. Across government, we're basically pumping out $5 billion in accommodation subsidy every single year. That's not capex. That's just a subsidy. That's what's happened in the last few years. And I think we step back and say, how can we do this better so we can get more houses that are adequate houses built, particularly by the private sector? Because most houses built in this country, 90% of homes built by private sector. So creating the conditions to enable more houses to be built by the private sector, as well as places like Chips and Kāinga Ora and Māori housing providers, that's absolutely the case. Now, you can only do that with the appropriate bulk and mains connections, unless you're, of course, out at a place like Rapiti where you can manage the septics and everything else at a localised level. That works in some places, not in all. Especially works adjacent to marae, because often you've got septics there that can accommodate.
Yeah.
So for us, making sure that the environment for privates to build houses is flexible and empowering enough is right top of mind. We've got a social system, social appropriations around housing. We need to make that work effectively and get the right house for the right location for people in genuine need. That's where we're at.
I've got a sup on that.
Oh, yes.
Very quickly.
Oh, yeah. So we all agree you've failed miserably in the housing area. Can I just ask you?
I don't agree.
You don't agree? Okay. All right, well, one person doesn't agree. In terms of, I just want to go back to the numbers, because you talked about the 200 million. See, 200 million is a lot less than $1 billion. So what we're saying is, well, it's not, what you're saying, it's not all bad, because there's 200 million, but that's a far cry from what we talked about when we said whai Kāinga, whai Orangara. And so basically, it's by Seymour for Māori now, isn't it? It's not by Māori for Māori.
What's your question?
Well, that's the question. So how do you, thank you for that. How do you conclude that 200 million does the business when previously we were looking at a $1 billion pūtea?
Well,
That just suggests to me you failed miserably.
Ultimately, I reject that opinion presented as a question, because what has happened is that the commitment over whai Kāinga, whai Oranga, a lot of that was consumed in the 1,000 homes through the Labour-led governments, and the 1,000 homes that have been approved in 18 months, by the way. We didn't take 5 years. In 18 months through this government, and those homes are on the go. Some have been delivered and some are yet to be delivered. And actually the capacity of Māori housing developers to deliver massively is evolving. It's evolving in beautiful places that we've been to. Second thing is that I think you've assumed or presumed where the funding is being reallocated and pitching it at a level that actually whānau Māori are not going to benefit from the protection of cost pressures around transitional housing first and other funding. And I reject that presumption. I think that's a very rich presumption to make that is not underpinned by accurate facts. I think ultimately we have to be very, very careful to assume that because that funding has been prioritised or reallocated, that it's not helping whānau Māori. I don't agree with that.
Oh, I'm disappointed about that, mate.
You are.
Taka time. Last question.
Kia ora. So I heard your kōrero yesterday about Papa Kāinga and the social services hearing. There's great things around Papa Kāinga for our whānau, but there's one problem, and that whānau have identified, is that they're struggling with the finance.
Yes.
To be able to achieve, putting homes on our own whenua. How is the department going to help our whānau achieve this?
Well, I think the first couple of things is that there continues to be some small amounts of pūtea available at Te Puni Kōkiri around Papa Kāinga, and I mentioned Willie's uncle-in-law earlier on, and that's good. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the role of Te Puni Kōkiri is not necessarily to fund everything. It's actually to monitor the adequacy of the services deployed by and delivered by agencies such as MHUD. And my expectation is Dave and the team will continue to not only monitor that, but report on how it can be done better. And we've seen some and had some wonderful examples, particularly over the last 5 or 10 years, about how Māori housing development, whether or not it's Kāinga or something more, we call it urbanised, but that's a nice way to describe it, urbanised in big towns and cities in New Zealand, how those things can be done better. Now, there are some great examples in the urban space, like Andrea and Te Rūnanga o Kirikiriroa Rifle Range Road, accommodating basically elderly kaumātua. They turned a bowling club into a kaumātua village. Absolutely fantastic. Okay, how can we make those examples or enable those examples to be replicated in other places? Absolutely. If the view is the government and ultimately the taxpayer should 100% fund all Papa Kāinga projects and applications that are presented to Te Puni Kōkiri, I think that would be a very, very challenging proposition. Not just because of the financial costs, but also the capability to deploy in a whole range of areas, including, far, far away. So I think one of the issues that we do face, and which has been the subject of the Finance and Expenditure Committee interrogation, is the way the banks have supported or otherwise the deployment of whānau housing across whenua Māori. Some of that has been tuned up. So at Ōwhata 2B and 7D the other day, even though it's whenua Māori and whānau building houses which they will own on top of their whānau trust land, the banks have actually come to the party. I think it's Westpac and maybe ANZ, it was definitely Westpac.
That's good.
To give better lending into Māori housing space, even though the land is owned by whānau trusts or corporations and trusts. The pressure that Minister Willis has put on the banks actually to be a little bit mindful around a whole range of initiatives, including lending, I think is very useful. And the Finance and Expenditure Committee, is anyone from that committee? Is anyone on that committee here?
No.
Part of the mahi that they were,
on the-
part of the mahi that they were undertaking was to look at how lending on Māori land can work better, and if there needs to be the relevant communications to the banks around making sure that that is equitable, for want of a better term, is important, because the Reserve Bank and others found that the difference in mortgage and interest costs, when that was securitised against Māori land or Māori projects, was actually material. Well, that ain't cool. It sort of feels like because we're Māori, we've got a higher interest rate. That's how it sort of feels to a lot of whānau. So that work in that space, I think, can also have a market effect. The other thing that I think is useful to understand is the community housing providers have been given quite a degree of support over the last 6 months, particularly around the expediting of the operating supplement more upfront. The Community Housing Funding Agency being established alongside people like Sam Stubbs from Simplicity, and some other arrangements that have made it easier for community housing providers to actually deploy and build more houses on Māori land or general land. My expectation and hope, I suppose, is that community housing providers, whether or not they're like Te Ahuru Mōwai out of Ngāti Toa or Salvation Army or anyone else, actually get more enthusiastic around deploying some of their skills, talents and capabilities alongside Māori housing developers and on Māori land.
Just a very quick comment from Commissioner before we move.
Yes, Minister, as you've raised the gaining capital, not just personally like on freehold Māori land, but even ahu whenua trusts and individuals who can afford to service loans are finding it hard to access them.
Absolutely.
So the comment is, please do throw your weight and influence behind making those changes in the inquiry.
Thank you. I'm only 85 kgs, but I'll try.
Yeah. Right, okay, let's move now on to the funding of Māori broadcasting.
Before we leave, because this is Steve Kerr. Steve is at the foundation of a lot of the mahi around Papa Kāinga, and I think it'll be useful because he's here and hasn't spoken yet, just to spend a couple of minutes describing what the standard's all about or what's going to be proposed, consultation on the standard. Steve.
Okay, where are you going?
So, thanks, Minister. I'll try and be quick.
Thank you.
So I guess the genesis of this was came out of the understanding that especially our regional kaimahi developed through TPK's role funding Papa Kāinga over the years, going back 10 years or so, and seeing that there are multiple barriers to developing housing in whenua Māori. one of which is resource consenting from district councils. So we looked into that in some depth, kind of reviewing provisions across district plans nationally in the current state, and then the opportunity arose through the resource management reforms that are happening currently to develop a national environmental standard, so a national kind of piece of secondary legislation to enable Papa Kāinga without a resource consent. So that's under consultation at the moment, and there's a lot of support out there for it, but we need to get the details right. And I mean, I can talk to the detail if people have questions, but I think that probably gives you a bit of background.
Okay, well,